Hello, and welcome to this ANSYS space claim tutorial on STL selection. I already have the part open here, but if you don't, you want to go to File, Open, go to the folder where you downloaded the file, and initially you may not see any file there. That's because the default file filter is set to space claim files, and this happens to be an STL file, but it doesn't hurt to choose all files, and that way you'll see everything in the directory. You can go ahead and select it and open it. Notice in the tree that we have a mesh here. STL meshes are a little different than regular solids. We're going to explore some of the similarities of selection and some of the differences. Now, just like a regular solid, you can always click a facet. Notice that if I click one, any previously selected facet becomes deselected. If I zoom in on one of these areas here, notice that I can pick a facet face, a facet edge, or a facet point. You'll notice this little dot hovers or highlights what you've selected, whether it's a face, an edge, or a point. Now, just like regular solid selection, you could always hold down the Control key and click additional facets to either add or remove them from your selection. And a number of other similar techniques work on STLs too. For example, if I double click on a facet face, it'll either grab all of the facets in that plane, or in the case of something that is more on the round side, it will also select ones that are near tangent. Notice here we have a little bit of a step between these two. So we can see that I can hold Control and double click here to grab the rest of the facets. Remember, in an STL, all of the facets are triangles, so these are not actually tangent, but this double clicking will get you close to tangent. In some scenarios, you may find a break between one half of a hole and another, so you could always double click one half, hold Control, and double click the other segments in order to select those. Notice how I was able to hold Control while I double clicked to add other sets of faces into my selection, and I could always add or remove if there's some facets that I did not intend to select. Now, in regular space claim solids, I can double click on an edge to select the loop, but you'll notice that by default, double clicking only works with faces, even if I'm highlighting an edge. Now, I might want to select all these faces here if I were, for example, going to move them all. Now, I am going to show some functionality related to the application of these different selections. Additional tutorials will go into more details on how to do these. Notice here that if I take this face and move it, it just translates that entire face up and down. But if I want to move the edges instead, what I do is I hold down the Shift key and I double click on an edge. Here, there's only one edge in this loop, but if I double click on this edge, notice it grabs this loop going all the way around. There is an angle that determines whether or not adjacent edges will be selected. Now notice here that if I take this loop of edges and I move them, I get much different behavior than if I move the face. Here it's as if I'm putting a draft on these faces or some sort of a chamfer by moving the edges instead of the face. Another application for selecting a loop of edges may have to do with reverse engineering. Notice here that if I wanted to use this loop of edges, notice that this loop of edges does not exist on any one plane. It is a 3D curve. This would be hard to extract for reverse engineering by going into cross sections. But here I can select that loop of edges, copy them with Control C, paste them with Control V. And if I go ahead and hide my solid here, I've now extracted the edges of the STL into curves if I wanted to turn this into a surface or do some reverse engineering. So double clicking works, but if you want to double click to select a chain or tangency with edges, you need to hold down Shift while you double click on that edge. So single clicking, Control Select, and double clicking work well with STLs, with some slight differences compared to solids. Box Select works as well. Now let's say I wanted to remove, translate, or change the size of this hole. In regular space claim, I would drag a box around the hole, And because that hole is one face, the entire face would get selected. But notice here that only the facets I was able to see were selected. If I rotate to this view and I reperform this box select, notice that only the ones I was able to see were selected. Now, if I go down to our selection filter in the bottom right, this little white arrow, and click that, notice that for face selection, we have this setting called automatic. Automatic and visible are very similar, but automatic has more applications in regular solids as opposed to STLs. If I go ahead and turn on the through option and I reperform this box select, notice it's highlighting facets that I cannot see. So again, if I wanted to select all of the facets in this hole, the easiest thing to do this in one box select is to change the face selection to through. Let me show you another area with a good example of this. Let's say I wanted to move or remove this tab over here. With this set to automatic, if I were to do a box select, say like this, notice it does not select the faces here or the faces on the bottom. So if I were to do a move operation, notice it's not moving all the faces. I get one type of behavior where it's putting this angle on here. If I undo back with Control Z or the undo button up here, and I go ahead and I change my selection filter to through, and I do that same box select, notice it has selected the faces down in there and on the bottom side. And if I were to perform that same move operation, it now works much more cleanly, moving all the faces in the intended manner. So be aware of the selection filter, changing it from automatic to through in order to select all the faces you want. Be aware that based on your orientation, you may get more than what you want. If I do a box select like this with the through option on, notice how many additional facets it picked up because of the orientation of my view. So it's important to be in a nice, clean orientation. Now, during STL editing or reverse engineering, there's some other selection techniques that are useful. Notice next to the selection filter, it shows us what our default drag select is. And the default is box select, which I showed before. I do want to point out that if I drag left to right, it selects facets inside of the box. And if I drag right to left, it selects any facet the box touches. The other options here are lasso select. Lasso allows me to drag, basically sketching around the model in order to select all of the facets inside of that lasso. Again, notice that the through option or the face selection option of through versus automatic also applies here. With it set to visible or automatic, it will select less than if I have the through option on. Another very useful selection technique for dragging is called paint select. Paint select works by holding down the mouse button and dragging across facets. Notice any facet I cross over gets selected. So for example here, maybe I might first try double clicking and it doesn't grab all the facets I want. If I start on this facet and simply drag across, it'll select every facet I cross over. Now again, this automatic, visible, and through applies. So if I change it to visible, I now have more control over what I'm selecting. But this could be very useful if there's a bunch of facets you want to select that are not on the same plane as each other. Maybe the double clicking doesn't work. This paint select is very useful for scan data because very often the facets on scan data are not planar or tangential enough. One last thing that may prove useful in selection of facets on an STL is when your STL is actually an assembly, but instead it comes in as a single mesh body. In our facets tab, there's an organized group with tools to separate one body or multiple bodies. If I turn on separate and I click this body here, notice that it separates that body. To select this entire body, I'm going to go back to my select tool and I'm just going to click on it in the tree. Now I have the ability to say use my move tool to translate that whole mesh to a new position, either translating, maybe I want to rotate it to another orientation, or even make a copy of this. So oftentimes you may need to separate out a mesh body in order to move it more easily. Also be aware in the Facets tab, there is a Separate All, which will break this up into all of the individual pieces. Here, I can select all of the pieces from the tree. I can go to my Display tab, and under Color, I can choose Randomize Colors. This can be very useful when dealing with multiple mesh bodies. Thank you, and have a great day.